Hello, welcome to PAX Fabulous. My name is Michael. You might recognize me, or you might not. Perhaps I've regenerated since we last met. That's right, this is a Doctor Who episode. I came into the Doctor Who fandom at an interesting time. Technically, the first episode I ever watched was The Impossible Astronaut. My dad wanted to get me to start watching the show with him, and so he invited me to watch the premiere of the new season with him. I was 12 years old, and this is the exact moment I tapped out. 2 years later, my dad got me to give it another shot. It was the 50th anniversary of the show when there was a brand new special to celebrate it. We watched it together. The special was hugely important to fans. It dropped some major lore and used a lot of nostalgic appeal, so of course, I didn't really appreciate it. It was fine. I was confused for a lot of it, but it was fun, and I wasn't terrified this time. So, when my dad invited me again to start watching the new season with him, starring Peter Capaldi as the new iteration of the Doctor, I agreed. And that's when I fell in love with Doctor Who. It was Peter Capaldi's 12th Doctor that I got attached to. His rough exterior and his dedication to compassion. And looking back, I feel pretty good about that. Series 9 is the best season of Doctor Who, and I will happily die on that hill. And if you couldn't tell by the theme of this channel, I'm usually pretty opposed to dying on hills. And frankly, so is the Doctor. While it's rare that the Doctor dances and everyone lives, that's usually his ultimate goal. The Doctor wants to protect and preserve life, and so his modern incarnations are usually pretty anti-war. Nowhere else is that clearer than in this two-part story told in the Zygon Invasion and the Zygon Inversion. A writer at the AV Club called these episodes Doctor Who's closing argument against war, and that's a pretty valid way to put it. In this story, the Doctor confronts and analyzes the fundamental nature of war, and all in hopes of preserving peace. However, despite the impact of the Doctor's speech, I'm afraid he ignores some pretty major issues that will just keep reinforcing conflict. I love these episodes. They're probably my favorite episodes of television ever. But they're not perfect. And I believe by identifying the flaws in the Doctor's approach, we'll be able to intervene in conflict even more effectively than he does. But first, let's revisit the context of the episode. Part 1, the Time Lore. Get it? It's like Time Lord crossed with Time War, Time Lore, and we're about to talk about the lore of the show. Well, I thought it was funny. Doctor Who is a science fiction show about a time-traveling alien. It started in 1963, and something important to understand about the show is that most of its iconic plot points and recurring elements were the result of a small budget and zero alternatives. It's like my great-aunt Susan Foreman always said, necessity is the mother of making things up over and over again and leaving an unintentionally permanent mark on the genre of science fiction forever. She was an odd lady. That's how we ended up with Daleks as iconic villains, or as with regeneration as a way to continue the show after an actor is ready to move on. It's why the TARDIS, the Doctor's time machine, looks like a police box all the time. And yet, despite its limitations, Doctor Who was a smashing success. As the show progressed, viewers learned about the Time Lords, a race of human-like aliens with the power over time, as well as the rest of the show's universe. And then the show was cancelled in the late 80s, and when it returned in 2005, the Doctor was the last of the Time Lords. What the heck happened? Over the course of the new series, viewers learned about the last great Time War, a massive armed conflict between the Time Lords and the Daleks that had stretched across timelines throughout the entire universe. It slowly became clear that both races had been driven to nearly to extinction. A few survivors kept cropping up in the show, but eventually viewers learned who was responsible. The Doctor.
What news of the Doctor?
He still possesses the moment, and he'll use it to destroy Daleks and Time Lords alike.
That's right. To make him a more sympathetic character for new viewers, they turned the Doctor into a victim of genocide, and then they also made him guilty of genocide. As it turns out, after fighting in the Time War and becoming disillusioned with all the bloodshed and violence being inflicted against innocent people, the Doctor took it upon himself to end the collateral damage by ending the Time War using a super weapon called the Moment. He destroys planet Gallifrey with all the Time Lords and all the Daleks. And this act is deeply scarring and traumatic for him, and for centuries he carries around the guilt of having killed his entire race as well as another entire race. One of his regeneration even counts the number of children who are on planet Gallifrey when he destroyed it. And then the 50th anniversary rolls around and we finally see the Time War. The moment turns out to have been an intelligent and powerful interface that alters time and space so that 3 versions of the Doctor meet up, and together they figure out a way to save Gallifrey instead of destroying it, and they destroy all the Daleks without killing all the Time Lords. Mission success! But something else important happens during the Day of the Doctor. A shape-shifting species called the Zygons attempts to invade and conquer Earth. See, their home planet was destroyed, and they want Earth as a new one. The Doctors get involved and erase the memories temporarily of both the Zygon and human leadership, leading them to create the most perfect treaty of all time, with safeguards all around, completely fair on both sides. As a result of the treaty, 20 million Zygons were permitted to adopt the appearances of random humans and to live out their lives in hiding on Earth, granting them a place to live without needing death to occur. In fact, it's this peaceful solution that inspires the Doctors to find a new way to end the Time War. As part of the treaty called Operation Double, a human and a Zygon remained identical. Their names were Osgood, and as a united pair of human and Zygon, they represented the very peace treaty. Were anything to happen to one of them, the treaty could break, and war could ignite. Hopefully it doesn't. Uh-oh. This rapidly spirals out of control as a splinter group of Zygons called Truth or Consequences begins working to undo the ceasefire, kidnapping the remaining Osgood and looking for a way to start a war and win their own planet by destroying humanity. And that should be enough context to begin understanding the Doctor's speech. Part 2, The Cycle of Violence. The story in these 2 episodes concludes with a fantastic speech given by the Doctor. If you want to watch it, there's a link in the description. And there's a lot that makes this a good speech. But I want to focus today on the centerpiece of the Doctor's speech, his scale model of war. The leader of Truth or Consequences, Bonnie, spends the episode looking for the Osgood box, kind of a MacGuffin that is said to have the power to win the war. It's a box with a button in it, apparently. Boxes with buttons to end a war. I wonder where the Doctor got that idea. But it turns out that there are 2 Osgood boxes, just as there were 2 Osgoods. And each box has 2 buttons. The blue box seems intended for Bonnie. One of the buttons will unmask every Zygon on Earth, and thereby start the war she wants. The red box seems handcrafted for Kate, the leader of UNIT, the Unified Intelligence Task Force that kind of defends Earth from aliens. One of the buttons in that box will release a deadly gas that will kill all Zygons on Earth. Genocide, perhaps, but maybe peace has to come at a cost. Do you really think I believe that? And yet each box also has the potential to backfire. Kate's box might nuke London, and Bonnie's might permanently turn the Zygons into humans. It's a gamble for both of them.
A box with everything I need. A 50% chance.
For us too.
There's no certainty that pressing either button will get either side what they want. And in fact, there's nothing either side can do to improve their chances of picking the right button. They can't choose victory, they can only choose violence. Growing up, I remember being taught that we can choose our actions, but we can't choose the consequences of our actions. Kate and Bonnie can choose to press a button, but they can't choose what happens after that button is pressed. They can't choose the consequences of those actions. And that's the Doctor's point in setting up the Osgood boxes.
This is a scale model of war. Every war ever fought right there in front of you. Because it's always the same. When you fire that first shot, no matter how right you feel, you have no idea who's going to die.
The boxes seem to make conflict random. They seem to take away the power and agency of the people standing at them ready to push the buttons. But what they really do is strip away the illusion of control. Bonnie and Kate still have the ability to choose how they end the conflict. They can
sit down and talk!
Or they can choose violence. They can try to win the war by death and bloodshed. And if they do try to do it that way, they give up control. They can't choose the consequences of violence, whether that violence is enacted by a box of alien technology or by an army of foot soldiers. Johan Galtung, often considered the founding father of peace studies, wrote that violence of any kind breeds violence of any kind. There are different kinds of violence, and we'll get into that later, but first let's focus on direct violence, which is what most people think about when they think of violence, and what the Doctor seems most concerned with. According to Galtung, direct violence breeds itself through revenge and offensive deterrence. We see an example of this in the Zygon Invasion, after Colonel Walsh's men are killed by Truth and Consequences.
I just lost my men. I'll quite happily bomb the hell out of anywhere.
It's easy to justify revenge. If violence was committed against you, it only feels right that you should commit retributive violence against the person who did it. But, if you're thinking that way, the other side probably is too. And when you hurt them in revenge, what you're really doing is encouraging them to repeat the offense as retaliation against your retaliation.
You start bombing them, you'll radicalize the lot.
The other way that direct violence breeds more violence is through offensive deterrence. That means inflicting violence to warn others not to attack you. For instance, Walsh orders a bomb strike on the church where the Zygons are hiding. The Zygons prevent the attack by taking the shapes of the soldier's family, but the damage is done. The attempt to commit violence was made. Again, consider this. If you think being violent will protect you from attack, your enemy might be thinking the same thing. And after you attack them to establish dominance, they now have reason to expect further violence, so they're going to try their own offensive deterrent. And as we've seen, when the soldiers try to take the church in person, the Zygons respond violently, executing them, which in turn invites Walsh's bombing as revenge, and thus the cycle of violence continues.
You just want cruelty to beget cruelty. You're not superior to people who were cruel to you. You're just a whole bunch of new cruel people. A whole bunch of new cruel people being cruel to some other people who'll end up being cruel to you.
A cycle of violence. That's what war is, isn't it? Two or more sides being violent against each other, and it's for as long as it takes before one of them is pushed to the brink of extinction, or even past it. At some point, hopefully, the white flag is waved and the violence seems to stop, at least for now. But those tensions remain. The direct violence might stop, but deeper indirect violence continues, and when the time comes, the violence will reignite. World War I was called the war to end all wars, and yet it led directly to World War II. Violence always breeds more violence. In the Doctor's words, cruelty always begets more cruelty. There might be a brief pause for a time, but in time, the war will reemerge. The Doctor knows this. He's probably seen it countless times, and he imposes an important hypothetical to Bonnie.
How are you going to protect your glorious revolution from the next one?
We'll win.
Oh, will you? Well, maybe you will win. But nobody wins for long. The wheel just keeps turning.
The cycle keeps revolving. Violence breeds violence, cruelty begets cruelty, and the wheel just keeps turning. So how do you stop the wheel? How do you break the cycle of violence? Well, I talk about this more in my Princess Mononoke video, but the answer is love. It sounds cheesy, but it's true. After laying bare the cycle of violence and unmasking the uncontrollable consequences of choosing violence, the Doctor begs Bonnie to change her mind and step down. And her response is telling.
I'm not stopping this, Doctor. I started it. I will not stop it. You think they'll let me go after what I've done?
She doesn't want to admit it, but she has changed her mind. She's not arguing against the Doctor's logic anymore. She's arguing against its consequences. She's acting out of fear, and frankly, my heart breaks for her. And so does the Doctor's.
You're all the same, you screaming kids. You know that? Look at me. I'm unforgivable. Well, here's the unforeseeable. I forgive you. After all you've done.
He offers love. And when Bonnie rejects it, tries to reject it, claiming he doesn't understand, he unloads all his Time War trauma on her and Kate. He may not have destroyed Gallifrey, but he spent centuries believing he did, and that had to take its toll on him. Plus, he fought plenty of battles before the fall of Arcadia. And when he shows Bonnie that he understands her, probably even more than she understands herself, when he shows her that his love for her, his forgiveness, is sincere and real, she submits. And both Kate and Bonnie step down. And so the ceasefire stands, and hang on, the ceasefire? What do you mean ceasefire? A ceasefire is a temporary pause in fighting, meant to lead to a long-term peace. It's not the end-all be-all. What does it say about the story that it ends with the upholding of a ceasefire rather than the implementation of actual peace? And while we're at it, the Doctor says that something like this has happened 15 times before. Not only is that one of the most narratively unsatisfying plot twists I've ever seen, it feels like it undermines the success reached in this episode. If it's been resolved before only to fail again, why would we believe that this resolution is different? What does it say about the ceasefire that it's almost broken 16 times? Well, it says that the Doctor is paying too much attention to direct violence and not enough to the underlying structural and cultural violence that is ignored and even reinforced by the current agreement with the Zygons. Don't get me wrong. The speech he gives is important, and the principles we've discussed so far all stand up to scrutiny. But there's more to peace than the cessation of direct violence, and in order to go beyond what the Doctor does, we need to know what the other kinds of violence are. Part 3, the conflict triangle. I think this is part 3. Did I put this wrong in my script? That'd be really awkward. No, I have it right. One of the most important things to know about Johan Galtung is that the man loved triangles. The only person I can think of who holds a candle to Galtung's love of triangles is Telly from Sesame Street. I don't know if anyone's gonna laugh at that joke. The point, or should I say vertex, is that Galtung liked to make a lot of triangular diagrams to relate peace principles to one another. One of the most notable is the conflict triangle, which he uses to make distinctions between different kinds of violence. See, violence is harm inflicted upon a person, but the way in which that harm is inflicted and the source of that harm helps differentiate the types of violence. The first type of violence is direct violence, which we've talked plenty about. This type of violence exists when there is an actor performing the violence. We usually think of this as physical violence, killing or maiming, but it can have psychological, emotional, or social aspects as well. Bullying, for instance, is a form of direct violence, whether it involves beating someone up for their lunch money, verbally abusing and degrading them, or spreading rumors about them. This is the easiest kind of violence to recognize because there are at least two parties involved, the actor and the victim. That also makes it the easiest kind to stop. You just stop the actor from being directly violent. That may be easier said than done, but it's a more easily measured change because it's a change in behavior. This next type of violence is called structural violence. This occurs when a community implements rules or systems that harm people, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to lose some of you here because it sounds like I'm talking about systemic issues. And that's because I am. Let me be clear, the existence of systemic problems doesn't erase the accountability of individuals, and solving them won't change the world, but it can make things better. Let me give a pretty simple example of some relatively harmless structural violence just to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Imagine a classroom of elementary school students. There are a couple of uncooperative kids in the class, and so to discourage the problem behavior, the teacher has implemented a rule. If no one will take the blame for wrongdoing in the classroom, the entire class will lose their privileges for recess for that day. One day, whenever the teacher's back is turned, one student crumples up the piece of paper and throws it at him. The student has earned a reputation among the class as a bit of a bully, and so when the teacher turns around to identify who threw something at him, nobody says anything. Nobody speaks up out of fear. After this happens a few times, the teacher gets frustrated and punishes the entire class for the one student's mistake. I'm drawing on this because it happened to me several times as a child, and I'm clearly over it. I'm fine. My point is that sometimes a rule that is made that treats people unfairly. That's what systemic problems are, and that's what structural violence is. We see examples, or at least evidence of it, in the Zygon episodes of Doctor Who. As part of the peace treaty, Zygons are permitted to go undercover around the world. However, it seems that they weren't given much support to make that easier.
They just turned up. No jobs, nowhere to live, no money.
The Zygons in New Mexico weren't taught how to blend in or given resources to help them take care of themselves. Without understanding the local customs and without the resources or skills to secure employment and housing, these Zygons clashed with their human neighbors.
Somebody once caught the briefest of glimpses of a Zygon in its proper form. A child who hadn't learned to preserve its body print. Been left alone to learn these things for itself.
While there is a degree of responsibility for taking care of oneself, it's impossible to do that from scratch. An infant can't take care of itself until it is raised up and cared for the entire time, till it's taught to take care of itself. UNIT and the Zygon High Command sent these refugees into the human world. They gave them the home that they wanted. But by failing to prepare them with knowledge and basic necessities, they set them up for failure. The systems meant to integrate the Zygons into human society were insufficient, and they inflicted structural violence that eventually led to direct violence. Another example of structural violence comes in the confrontation in Turkmenistan. Osgood's been taken captive, and UNIT ostensibly should want to rescue her. But at this point, UNIT is more of a military operation than anything else, and when the Doctor arrives, the task force is already preparing to bomb the church. Here's the deal, and I say this with a tremendous amount of gratitude for the sacrifices made by countless military personnel who have given their lives and personal peace in order to secure my rights and personal peace, to give me the life that I enjoy. Soldiers are trained for war. During World War II, the military analysis named SLA Marshall gathered data indicating that soldiers were unlikely to fire their weapons at the enemy. In response to that research, the military developed training strategies meant to erode that anti-killing impulse. Although individual soldiers and leaders in the military may be selfless heroes and noble warriors, the system that trains them wants to turn them into killers. That's structural violence. And it explains why UNIT's task force so quickly turns to direct violence. The final point on the conflict triangle is cultural violence. In Galtung's own words, this type of violence refers to the way in which the act of direct violence and the fact of structural violence are legitimized and thus rendered acceptable in society. It's the things that we believe that let us justify other types of violence. These might include actively harmful beliefs, like the belief that one race is superior inherently to another, but they don't have to. They can come from innocent beliefs. In the case of our elementary school classroom, the teacher probably uses collective punishment because he believes that it will encourage empathy and sympathy and regret in the disobedient children, and then therefore discourage future misbehavior through guilt and regret. On its own, that isn't a harmful belief. But the teacher also seems to believe that the collective punishment has no significant detriment to the innocent kids, or at least that the detriment is outweighed by the benefits to the disobedient kid. The combination of these beliefs is what leads the teacher to justify his structural violence. And because of that, they're an example of cultural violence, of a belief that leads to more violence, that justifies more violence. So is there cultural violence in Doctor Who's Zygon story? Holy crud nuggets, yes. Let's start with a simple example of it. Colonel Walsh again. As we've seen, Walsh is incredibly ready to resort to direct violence by bombing the church at the earliest sign of possible justification. She's also a participant in structural violence through her leadership of a militarized task force. So what beliefs might be driving this inclination towards direct and structural violence?
Any living thing in this world, including my family and friends, could turn into a Zygon and kill me any second now. It's not paranoia when it's real.
Yeah, that will do it. Now, there's definitely a degree of truth to what Walsh is saying. The Zygons in Truth or Consequences can take the shape of any living thing, and there is evidence to suggest that they'd want to kill her. So maybe it's not paranoia, but it is fear. And really, that's not all. There are some deeper underlying beliefs that Walsh isn't admitting. For instance, there's the belief that Zygons are just as likely to turn to violence as she is. A fair belief, perhaps, and likely an accurate one, but not exactly one that encourages you to put away the bombs and talk. And there seems to be an underlying belief that Zygons are inferior beings, that their lives aren't worth as much. After they're aliens. Earth isn't even their planet. They probably don't even eat beans on toast for breakfast. Can you even imagine? And so, driven by these beliefs and enabled by the structural violence of a militarized unit, Colonel Walsh resorts to direct violence against the Zygons as the best way to resolve conflict. Can you see how these three types of violence are linked together? Cultural violence justifies and legitimizes the other two. Structural violence creates an official outlet for direct violence and then gives structure and form to cultural violence. Recurring direct violence can turn into structural violence, and it can invite cultural violence by requiring beliefs to change in order to support what is happening. In a lot of ways, cultural violence is a foundation upon which the other kinds of violence stand. But the triangle can be turned in any direction to show the complex relationship between the three different types of violence. So, now that we've discussed the different kinds of violence, tell me what kind of violence we're seeing in this clip. That's right, it's direct violence. Okay, what about this one?
We've been treated like cattle.
So what?
Oh, okay, doctor. Anyways, yeah, that's structural violence. What about here?
Don't think of them as rational. They're different. They don't care about human beings. They don't care about their own people. They think the rest of Zygon kind are traitors.
Whoa. Yep, that's cultural violence. It's a belief that could lead to further violence. After all, if the enemy isn't rational, then why bother trying to reason with them? Why not just go straight to violence? and it's coming straight from the Doctor. In fact, there's some major cultural violence occurring below the surface of this entire story. One major belief is driving every act of violence we see, whether direct or structural. Here's a hint.
Humans cannot accept the way we really are.
Truth or Consequences is a group driven by this belief, the belief that humans would reject Zygons in their natural form. It's why Bonnie wants to use the Osgood box to expose every remaining Zygon left in hiding. And the terrorists aren't the only ones with this belief. See, the peace treaty required the Zygons to take on human form in order to take refuge on Earth. The ceasefire, was created by both humans and Zygons, neither of which knew what they were. That means that both Zygons and humans believed that Zygons needed to stay disguised in order to maintain peace.
Panic. Paranoia. What would happen if they knew who we were?
Galtung said that violence is present when individuals are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. In other words, violence occurs when somebody's physical or mental capacities are restricted. It's a really broad definition, and one that I don't entirely agree with all the time, but it does leave room for the different kinds of violence. And in this case, restricting Zygons from using their shape-changing abilities at will means that their somatic realizations are below their potential, and that's structural violence. But that's not the main belief driving the conflict in this episode. It's a hint, but the cultural violence I'm concerned with actually generates the one we just talked about. Here, let's see it in action.
Which one are you? Human or Zygon?
Okay, and maybe just another time to confirm.
I need to ask you. Because it's important. Because it might matter.
And what's important?
Which one are you, human or Zygon?
And actually, let's get it from somebody else, just for good measure.
You are you,
I'm me.
but human or Zygon?
You know what, Doctor? One more time, just to be safe.
I need to know. Which one are you?
I'm Osgood.
Human or Zygon?
Okay, perfect. Thank you, team. Team bigotry? Yeah, that's right. You want to know what the big bad belief behind this war is? What the cultural violence that drives all the other violence is? It's the belief that there is some fundamental, unalterable difference between humans and Zygons that matters more than anything else about them. It's the belief that the most important thing about Osgood isn't what she does or who she is, it's what she is. Human or Zygon. It's the belief that the answer will change something. Because that's why the other belief exists, isn't it? The only reason that humans might not trust Zygons if they knew of their existence would be if there was a meaningful distance between them. Shapeshifting doesn't count. Humans can lie and deceive and hide too. The insidious belief in a difference between Zygons and humans isn't about capability, although its defendants might hide behind that argument. It's not a descriptive belief, it's an evaluative belief. It's about how Zygons and humans differ in value, in worth. It's about who matters less. You might recognize this kind of belief from real life, and if you don't, you should probably start paying more attention. There are a handful of other examples of cultural violence in this episode. The Doctor's inability to see the conflict as something more three-dimensional in his interaction with Atuan, or Kate's argument that the peace with the Zygons was an impossible situation. But this ultimate violent belief is what lies at the core of the conflict. As long as humans or Zygons believe that there is an impassable difference between them, that cultural violence will continue. Paranoia and fear will control them. The ceasefire will maintain negative peace, and positive peace will remain out of reach. And the ceasefire might almost break 16 more times. Nothing will really change as long as this cultural violence persists. But there is hope. Kate and the Doctor might be entrenched in cultural violence, but there's really two characters who aren't.
Doesn't matter which of us is which.
You know the funny thing about the Osgoods? Back when the peace treaty was being negotiated, one of them started having a coughing fit, and the other one handed her the inhaler, the one that the Zygon had taken at the beginning of the story. Everyone in the Black Archive was forced to negotiate a treaty by having their memory erased of what they were. Everyone but the Osgoods. They negotiated a fair treaty, one that benefited both sides because they genuinely wanted it. They were the only ones in that room who chose omnipartiality instead of having it thrust upon them. Perhaps that's why they play such an integral role in upholding the peace treaty. Maybe they volunteered. The point is that both Osgoods overcome and discard the cultural violence that would separate them and turn them against each other. And by the end of the Zygon episodes, someone else has had the same epiphany.
Human or Zygon?
I'll answer that question one day. And do you know when that day will be? The day nobody cares about the answer. Gotcha.
That's right. Bonnie has become Osgood, and she no longer believes in an insurmountable difference between humans and Zygons. She has changed drastically, abandoning cultural violence that even the Doctor hasn't relinquished. Now that we know about direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence, let's talk about their opposites: direct peace, structural peace, and cultural peace. Let's talk about how to bring them about. Part 3, conflict interventions. This refers to the involvement of third parties in helping to resolve a conflict, and there's a lot of flexibility here. For instance, how actively do the third parties participate in the process? Galtung gives us an 11-point scale that goes from low involvement to high involvement. On one end, we've got a type 0 intervention, which is where third parties don't get involved, and the relationship between the conflicting parties disintegrates. Personally, I don't think this is really the goal. But honestly, it's only slightly worse than a type 10 intervention, where a third party enters in, takes complete control over the conflict, institutes a dictatorship, and enforces their own solution without the consent of the conflicting parties. That's no good. That's how you end up with alien zombie monks running the world.
Editing Michael here. When I was filming this, the battery on the camera kept dying. I was renting it and I had forgotten to charge it up. And I thought it had died after I said a bunch of stuff. But instead, it died before all of that. And so there's a huge chunk of this video that I didn't get recorded, that I thought I did. So I'm going to record it now. While there are benefits and costs to every level of intervention, and certain conflicts might respond better to different amounts of third-party involvement than others, the sweet spot is generally probably going to be around types 4, 5, and 6. Galtung referred to these as symmetric dialogical communication with outside parties. This means that these types of interventions keep the conflicting parties and the third parties on equal footing, which is symmetric, and both the inside and outside parties work together in tandem to resolve the problems, which is dialogical. What distinguishes these three types from each other is the service provided by the third party. And the Doctor would probably love the terms we use here: diagnosis, prognosis, and therapy. Diagnosis involves determining the state of the conflict. For instance, when Kate goes to New Mexico to find out what happened to Osgood, she's focused on trying to gather information and understand what happened. Technically, this isn't exactly diagnosis because the conflict has already taken place and played out, but there isn't really a good example of diagnosis in this episode. If there was, maybe the Doctor would have recognized and addressed the cultural violence at the root of this war.
Prognosis is an evaluation and prediction about the outcome of the conflict. Are things going to go well? Are they going badly? Does outside intervention need to happen? Or can the parties resolve the conflict on their own? It may seem silly to ask these questions as a third party. After all, you're already getting involved by giving a prognosis. But sometimes all the intervention that is needed is an expert telling the people that what they're going to do is end badly. Sometimes a warning is enough to prevent further escalation.
You start bombing them, you'll radicalize the lot.
But sometimes it isn't. A type 6 intervention gets the third party involved in determining the plan for therapy, which refers to any action taken to reduce the violence and resolve the conflict. On the one hand, conflicting parties are usually more committed to a therapy they come up with themselves. And so an effective conflict intervention might be hands-off for this part. On the other hand, a trained expert might be more knowledgeable about what kinds of solutions might be most powerful and lasting in this context. A good mediator practices rhetorical sensitivity and reacts to the context in order to find the degree of involvement that is most effective under the unique circumstances of unique conflicts. Another important factor in conflict intervention is its focus. In his book, The Third Side, which I have here, it's a good book. William Ury outlines roles that individuals can take to help contain, resolve, and prevent destructive conflicts. As it happens, his approach lines up fairly well with Galtung's own distinctions between different categories of conflict interventions: peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. We tend to use these words fairly interchangeably in day-to-day conversations to describe any way or any effort made to promote peace, and that's a totally valid way to use them. However, in Galtung's nomenclature, what makes these different from one another is the type of violence that they focus on. Let's start with peacekeeping, which is concerned with direct violence. Ury writes that when violence or contention breaks out, third parties can intercede in hopes of containing the power struggle so that the parties may be brought back to the negotiating tables. He breaks this category down into 3 specific roles. First, you might need a witness. The goal of a witness is to discourage the escalation of violence by simply paying attention to the situation and making aggressors aware that they will be held accountable. Alternatively, you might be a referee, which means that when you're unable to stop or prevent the conflict entirely, you set limits on the fighting. Systems like the Just War tradition or the Geneva Conventions are meant to do just this, legislating the amount of harm that can be done and on whom it can be inflicted. This might also include efforts to reduce the amount of weaponry available in a conflict. Finally, when non-combatants and innocents are endangered or when the violence spins out of control, as it always will, peacekeepers get involved by placing themselves in the middle of the fight and slowing things down. Effective peacekeepers are responsible for exercising force in a way that minimizes harm and violence. You can check out my Princess Mononoke essay for more on what that might look like, but suffice it to say that effective peacekeepers must rely on a blend of non-violence and restrained force motivated by compassion and mercy for all parties involved in the conflict. While the process of stopping direct violence may occasionally require the use of force, Yuri argues that the best peacekeepers never fight. They never fight because they don't need to. They accomplish their ends by intervening early and using persuasion. When it's done right, peacekeeping in any role reduces direct violence without contributing to or perpetuating the cycle of violence, contention, and war. Structural violence, on the other hand, is dealt with by peacemakers. The process of peacemaking is described by Galtung as the search for creative, sustainable outcomes of the conflict. This is about coming to agreements and creating systems to maintain peace, and in that way it creates a space for generating structural peace instead of structural violence. In larger scale conflicts, this is the top-down approach, the system by which governments and representatives negotiate ceasefires and treaties on behalf of larger groups. However, relying upon the elites and leaders to resolve conflicts is itself a form of structural violence because it takes power away from the people. Galtung suggests that to encourage structural peace, the peacemaking process should generate a visible flow of peace ideas from everywhere in society and tap the insights all over, marginalizing nobody. So what third side roles might contribute to peacemaking? Well, Yuri identifies 4 roles that are meant to resolve conflict. The first is the mediator, who deals with conflicting interests by facilitating communication and guiding parties to find alternative solutions to their conflicts. Some of the conflict transformation principles I talk about in my Emma video might help out here. The next is an arbitrator, who steps in when rights are disputed and when parties reach an impasse. Judges and justices are an obvious example of this role, and when they use their authority responsibly, they can set or overturn precedents in ways that disrupt structural violence and promote justice. Now, when a conflict involves a significant power imbalance, an equalizer can help move the peacemaking process along by empowering the weaker party and exercising limits on the dominant party. An effective equalizer is one who is committed to democracy and omnipartiality. Finally, when a long-lasting conflict has eroded the trust and destroyed the relationship between 2 parties, a healer can step in to help them reconcile, at least enough to formulate an agreement that stops further violence. Each of these roles helps create structural peace by facilitating the creation of peaceful conflict agreements. But there's one more role that I'd like to introduce, the advocate. It's not enough to resolve current conflicts in ways that generate structural peace rather than structural violence. There's also a need to identify and overcome forms of structural violence that were instituted in the past and continue to harm people, intentionally or unintentionally. Each of these roles helps make peace from the top down by encouraging creative and constructive solutions to conflicts both past and present, dismantling structural violence and instituting structural peace. And that brings us to cultural violence. Where peacemaking is a top-down process, the antidote to cultural violence is a bottom-up process called peace building. If the leaders of 2 warring groups come to a resolution, but the citizens of both countries are still culturally committed to the conflict, they're just going to replace those leaders with ones who will keep the war going. Peace building is about changing the beliefs and desires of a group so that they believe in and want peace. From Yuri's point of view, it's about preventing destructive conflict. Conflicts can sometimes erupt due to unmet needs, so the provider is a role that enables people to meet their needs, whether those are physical, emotional, mental, or even social. A major cultural contributor to intergroup violence is separation between groups. So the role of the bridge builder is one that fosters relationships between groups and across conflict lines. A bridge builder makes sure that we keep seeing each other as people, despite the differences we may have. They eradicate cultural violence through the literal power of friendship. And then there's the teacher. This one is close to my heart because it's what I'm trying to accomplish on this channel. Yuri says that the role of the teacher is to give people skills to handle conflict. They delegitimize violence, they teach tolerance, and they teach conflict management skills. And that's all very important, but I think it needs to be more than that. A teacher is a peace builder who invites their students to change the very way they think about and perceive peace and conflict. See, I'm an English major, and one of the most important things I've learned as an English major is that the stories we tell both reflect and shape our beliefs and worldviews. Storytellers embed their beliefs in the stories that they tell, whether they mean to or not. And when we read to or listen or watch a story, we take the perspective of the characters and the narrator. And that means we adopt some of the storyteller's beliefs, even temporarily. Empirical research shows that this happens. And it shows that those changes in belief can be long-lasting. So many of the stories we're told in the Western world convey very specific beliefs about conflict. It's scary, it's destructive, it's only solved through violence. My goal with this channel is to point out and elevate the alternative solutions. It's why I point out that Jane Austen's Emma treats conflict as a good thing rather than something to avoid. It's why I talk about how Ashitaka follows the way of the peace warrior in Princess Mononoke. And it's why I love Doctor Who. It's a show that opposes war, especially in the episodes we've talked about today. In Peter Capaldi's final episode as the Doctor, he meets the first iteration of the Doctor, and that first Doctor gets a preview of what he will one day become.
The Doctor has walked in blood through all of time and space. The Doctor has many names. Destroyer of the world! The Imp of the Pandorica. The Shadow of the Barnyard. The Beast of Trenzalore. The Butcher of Skull Moon, the last tree of Arsenal, the destroyer of Skaro. He is the Doctor of War.
It doesn't sound great, and there's no denying that the Doctor does terrible things in his future. But by the end of the episode, we find out what it really means to be a Doctor of War. It means intervening in war and trying to save people. It means compassion and love in the face of violence and cruelty. The Doctor isn't perfect. In the Zygon episodes, he misses the structural and cultural violence at the root of the conflict that apparently keeps repeating. But he does care. He's committed to finding an end to the cycle of violence, and he's committed to helping others join him on the side of peace. I'm trying to do the same thing. So, what about you? Will you join us? After all, you know more than the Doctor does now. You know why violence breeds violence and cruelty begets cruelty. You know the different kinds of violence. You know how conflict intervention works. And I bet you know what role you would probably be best at playing. So, what now? The video's about to end, but you're a Doctor Who fan, or at least enough of a Doctor Who fan to watch this video. You know that there's never really an ending. The Doctor regenerates. And so do we. Every ending is just a new beginning. The end of war is the beginning of peace. The beginning of love is the end of hate. The end of this video could be the beginning of a new life, one dedicated to helping end contention and violence in all of its forms. Until next time, peace.